Okay, hi everybody. So my name is Sydney Fouché and I am the ACRU Trainee Program Lead. And today I'll be presenting on Introduction to Abstract Writing. So I wanted to let everybody know that this call again will be recorded. The slides will be shared after the presentation. There are some slides where I'll be asking for your input, so please feel free to chime in. You don't have to be shy. And then ask any questions that you have at any point in time. So what exactly is an abstract? So an abstract is a summary of a scientific project, study, or analysis. And there are actually different types of abstracts. So the two that we're going to focus on today in this presentation are the conference abstract and a manuscript abstract. There are other types like executive summaries, and these are used for different purposes, whether they be government reports or um, project summaries online. But as I mentioned, today we'll be focusing on the conference abstract and the manuscript abstract. So usually abstracts fall between 200 and 500 words, and the way that an abstract is written should be a standalone summary in order to help others understand your work and essentially why it matters. So this is one of the abstract types that I mentioned previously. It is a conference abstract, and this is a brief summary of work that you might showcase at a research conference. So the work that you're showcasing for a conference generally applies to a particular field of interest, and the information in this type of abstract will provide some information about the work that you're doing, but it should also demonstrate value that your work brings to the conference and to whatever field of interest the conference is being held for. So conferences will usually provide very specific criteria that will be used to critically review or assess your abstract. So this will be things like word focus, content, word limit, and usually there's notes to authors about things that folks who are judging conference abstracts would like to see. This particular abstract that you see on the screen was developed for the Enhancing Pre-Hospital Outcomes for Cardiac Arrest project in order to showcase the work that the Acute Care Research Unit has done. And this was actually presented at an annual conference aimed at improving the quality of care and outcomes for cardiac arrest. So take a minute to look at the slide, note the content of the abstract and the different components. Okay, so this, what we have on the screen here is a manuscript abstract, and this is one of the other abstract types that I previously mentioned. It is a brief summary of the work that you'd like to be showcased in a publication. So a manuscript that would be published in a scientific journal. And this work, what you see captured in this abstract, generally applies to a particular field of interest. So very similar to what you might present in a conference. However, the information in the abstract will provide information about the value of this work. It will provide information about what readers can expect to see in your manuscript. And it should also provide some details about how this work contributes to the field overall. So that big picture significance. So what are you adding to the evidence base that we don't already know about? And then journals will usually provide very specific criteria that will be used to critically review the manuscript itself in its entirety, including how the abstract should be structured. So this includes like word limits, any particular sections that they like the abstract to be separated by. And this particular abstract was developed for the Enhancing Pre-Hospital Outcomes for Cardiac Arrest project in order to showcase some of the work of the unit, for our first aim of the study. And you might notice some differences here in the way that this abstract is captured versus the previous example that I showed you. Some things that really stick out to me as I'm looking at this are the way that the abstract categories are captured. So in the previous example, instead of using introduction, we have aim here. And we'll talk about some of these differences and what that means for writing an abstract in some of the upcoming slides. So there are a couple of general do's and don'ts when you're writing abstracts. So it's important that in everything we do, we acknowledge prior work. So do look at examples of prior work. I can't stress how important this is. So there's so much work that's been done before you've touched a topic likely that you can usually look at the literature, if it exists, around your topic to see how others have outlined their studies in an abstract. And that should give you some ideas of things that you might want to capture when you're writing up a summary of your study and working to communicate the value of your work. You also want to include clear, concise content. So you can think of an abstract like an elevator pitch, right? So if you only have 30 seconds to grab somebody's attention and to really communicate how important your work is, one way to be effective is to make sure that you've really honed in on the key elements of your work, including, why your work's important, any context that surrounds your work, gaps that you aim to address, and where your work might go next. So you want to be really clear and concise in any of the content that you include. You also want to use effective writing. So abstracts require the use of active voice. So oftentimes we're using measurable action words. So things like explain, compare, identify, design, discuss. It requires that we use an active voice in order to convey what we've done. We also, in using effective writing, want to capture only one thought or idea per sentence. So it's very important that you try not to cram multiple ideas or thoughts into one sentence. And that goes back to that point about being clear and concise. And oftentimes that requires a lot of, thought on the end of the person who's writing this abstract. So thinking about how we can clearly convey our points. We also want to refrain from using sentence fragments. So you can think of an abstract as, a paragraph. So being no more than 200 to 500 words, but you're using clear, concise, and complete sentences to explain your study and what you've done. You also want to make sure that any acronyms you use, you're providing an explanation before you use them. So things like OCA or out of hospital cardiac arrest. You would write out of hospital cardiac arrest and then in parentheses put OCA. But you don't want to, just put in the acronym for OCA without providing an explanation, because you can't assume that your audience is always going to know what you're talking about. So that brings me to our next point, which is refrain from using jargon. So this comes with really understanding your audience. So being aware of, who's going to be looking at this abstract, what do they need to know about your work, the value of your work? Are they familiar with the terminology that you're going to be communicating in your abstract? So for example, I mentioned that EPOC was previously presented at several national conferences. At each of these conferences, we had folks who were experts in pre-hospital care and in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. So they're well aware of what the acronym OCA means or what the acronym for CPR means. But if I were presenting at, like the American Public Health Association or somewhere else that's a bit removed, maybe a bit removed from resuscitation fields where this jargon is not, commonly thrown around, that's something that I'd want to refrain from using without explanation. You also don't want to use colloquial words. So there's a certain balance that we have to maintain in our language when we're writing an abstract. So you don't want to be overly formal, but you also don't want to use words like so and stuff. Finding a good balance to make sure that your writing is clear and effective without being too formal or too informal. You also want to refrain from using terms that require lengthy definitions. So, as I mentioned, you're working with 200 to 500 words, and that's not a lot of that's not a large limit. When you're trying to convey points, so you really aren't going to have time to elaborate on the definition of a word. So you want to use language that is simple enough for folks to understand, but aren't jargon terms that are going to require long and lengthy definitions. You also want to refrain from including references. So if you think back to the example that we have for this manuscript piece, although you're going to be capturing and citing references in the body of the manuscript, you want to refrain from citing references in your abstract. And then oftentimes it's helpful to first outline what you think are the key points for each part of your study, and then begin putting together the pieces of your abstract. This can be particularly useful if you're writing a conference abstract and really working to figure out what information from your study is key to share. So if you don't have a full manuscript text to work from, and you're starting from scratch where you're really, you've been documenting the methods of your study and what you've been doing, but you're trying to figure out how to best convey that to an audience, it's helpful to sit down and to write out an outline of what you think key points are for your introduction, your methods, your results, and your conclusions. If you're attempting to write an abstract for a manuscript, it's usually suggested that you leave the abstract writing until the rest of the manuscript has been written. This will save you a lot of headache. So, once you've gotten to the end of your manuscript, you should have a better idea of what key points you need to convey to your audience so that they can understand the value of the work that you've done. And it's suggested that for this manuscript abstract type in particular, the reverse outlining technique can be very helpful. So what this means is that you'll start with the very last section of your manuscript, which is usually the discussion section, and you'll make an outline of 1 to 2 key summary points from each section of the paper. Starting from the conclusions or the discussion will allow you to anchor the discussion around whatever that key point is that you want to convey, that value. And then when you put all of these key points together, you have an abstract. Finally, as a do, I want to stress that the write, review, edit, and revise method is very helpful. So, taking time to be thoughtful about your abstract and the points that you want to include, taking time to review and edit often means that you may cut, 20 to 30% of what you've initially captured in your abstract. You may find ways to make it more concise. And then repeating this process, over again will allow you to end up with a product that is making use of all of the things that I mentioned. So using effective writing, having clear and concise content, and really conveying the value of your work. So I'm going to let everybody know that we're going to be shifting gears a little bit here. So in the following slides, we'll actually be breaking down an example of a recent epoch abstract. And I'm going to introduce you to each section of the abstract, piece by piece, including what type of content you'll include for each section. Then I'll ask everybody to take a few minutes to read that section carefully and to think about where that content is captured according to the red boxes. So I've broken up the abstract components and tried to capture them in a way that folks can use to understand what information is most vital to capture when you're writing an abstract. So we'll discuss each of these sections as a team and have a few minutes for questions before moving on to the next section. Okay, so we'll start with the title of this abstract. So to give everybody a little bit of background, this particular abstract, as I mentioned, is an epoch abstract, and it was put together for the purpose of a conference. So it's a conference abstract. So titles, when you're writing an abstract, should be straightforward. They should be clear and convincing. They should also avoid, beginning with the word the. And if you can, you should try to highlight a few keywords from your study. So this could include things like noting who your intended audience is. So who might be using your results, or who might find your findings, most applicable. So I've outlined, a few key components of the title here. They're captured in red boxes, and I'm going to ask that everybody take a minute to read the title carefully, and then we'll talk about what each of these boxes are. Okay, so does anybody want to take a stab at the first box and why that's there? What does that tell us about the study?
Maybe the way they were conducting the study, like exploring different studies or researchers.
Thank you. Was that Musharraf?
Yes.
Hi, Musharraf. Good to hear your voice. Yes, you are spot on. So that word is active language, and it absolutely gives us clues as to the methods that are being used in this study. And it is a qualitative study. So we can tell from this word that the study is going to be at least in part qualitative. Okay, does anybody want to take a stab at the second box?
It kind of tells the scale of the project in the sense that it's not just saying police or firefighters, but the emergency medical system as a whole.
Mhm, mhm. Yes, yes, it does give us clues about, yes, the approach and the scope of the project. Thank you, Emmanuel. Anybody want to take a stab at the third box? Okay, so the third box pertains to our audience of interest and also who might be most affected by the outcomes of the study. Uh, fourth and fifth boxes.
Those tell like the problem at hand, or I guess like the problem which we're trying to find the solution to through like the other boxes.
Yes, yes, exactly. Uh, any other thoughts on this?
I thought it could also be like the topic of interest that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts on this? Okay, you guys are exactly right. So, break it, you can see how important having a title that captures, key words from the study. The title tells us everything that we need to know about the study before we even get into the abstract. It's that clear. So I'm going to move on to the introduction, but I want to make sure that all questions have been answered. Does anybody have questions on this title slide? Okay. So here we have the introduction. So an introduction is a very short statement on what the readers need to know in order to understand the context of the problem. So this context can be historical, it can be political. The context that you're going to want to capture is dependent on the audience. And this should convey the importance of the issue or the problem. In the introduction, you might also include the study aim. So if you think back to the two examples that I had at the beginning of the presentation, where I mentioned in one of the abstracts, there was the introduction piece, but in the other abstract, it was captured as the aim. So the introduction, there are two slight differences here. So an introduction can be inclusive of background content and your aim. The aim is what you intend to do, with the study. So usually this will be, you know, how your study fits into the big picture. So what has been done prior, what gaps have been left by what has been done prior, and what your study aims to do in order to fill those gaps. It might also be a hypothesis. So, you know, what you anticipate your study might uncover. And then oftentimes you'll find that the introduction is mixed tense. So I'm gonna leave it up to you guys to figure out which of the tenses tend to be used when you're capturing the statement on what readers need to know about the background versus the aim, but it is mixed tense. So it's important to pay attention to that. And then now I'd like to hear from you guys, anything that comes to mind when you see this introduction generally, and then, you know, what you're thinking about the red boxes and what they capture. Any initial thoughts on the introduction?
I saw that they kind of put in the acronyms, I think, like if it's out of hospital cardiac arrest, they put the OHCA, OCA in parentheses so that it's referenced later. And I think the red boxes are kind of indicating like the top one, I think, is talking about like the actual background information, while the second box is talking about what the study will be exploring or actually talking about.
Thanks, Hannah. That's correct. Any thoughts from folks on the tenses?
Seems like they're trying to keep it in the present tense. Like even when they're talking about prior work, they said like prior work indicates that BCPR has a greater impact, and like instead of saying like it has had, or like going into the past tense, they try to keep it in the present, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is, yes, this is, part of this is in the present tense. Part of it calls your attention to the past tense. So like you mentioned, Musharraf, when it says prior work, that's calling our attention to the past so that we acknowledge what's been done before us. And any thoughts on the second box? Notice any keywords?
When I was looking at it, promoting stood out to me because it's like kind of a future
Mhm.
event. still like working to make that happen. So it like starts in present and then I would say switches to future.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. And you're getting at something important. So within these first couple of sentences, it's telling you about the intended impact of the study. So, taking it from the past and seeing what's been done and letting you know that this is essentially the gap here. So we have not, been able to promote timely bystander response across the board, but this is what we would like to do. This is the intended impact of our study. Any other key words that folks noticed?
Just where it says including, it kind of limits the scope since it's such a large, the first box is such a large topic, right? Just including it kind of immediately limits down the groups that the study will be discussing.
Exactly. Is that Alex who was speaking?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alex. Yes, exactly. And there's one more before we move on. It's active language pertaining to the methods. Okay, the last word is explores. So it brings your attention back to the title of the study, and it also tells you about the methods that are going to be employed. So explores gives you some clues that this might be a qualitative study. Okay, so here we have the methods, and this should include a couple of things. So here it's very important that we talk about the study design. We want to let folks know our approach. So how we attempted to answer our research question and what methods were used. We also want to let folks know our setting, as well as the time frame in which this was conducted. And we want to let folks know what analytic approach was used. So what was done to answer the research question. So I want to note here that there are a few differences between what you're going to note in terms of the study design versus what you'll note regarding the analytic approach. So a study design gives you an overview of generally the methods that were used in a study and in what order they may have occurred. So if you use multiple methods to answer your question, this gives you some clues and insights into what order they may have occurred. The analytic approach is going to pertain more specifically to exactly what was done within those larger methodological frameworks. So by methods, I mean quantitative or qualitative. So quantitative, you can think of as numerical data, and giving you measures or helping you to understand associations or relationships of something, or how much things are related versus qualitative, which is often used to explore something, or to, you can think of that as perspectives. So it provides us with content that we might not get from a quantitative data. Often this section is most written in past tense. So unlike the introduction section, which tends to be mixed, this section is written in past tense. So there are a couple of boxes here. Can folks identify which methods were qualitative versus which were quantitative?
I believe the box that says logistic regression was quantitative because it's just looking at statistics.
That's correct.
I would say that the box that says these data were supplemented with semi-structured key informant interviews would be qualitative.
And do you spot another part of the qualitative data collection process?
Was that a question for me? Sorry.
Oh, yes, it's for you or anybody.
I guess like the site visits are also qualitative.
Yes, that's correct. Any thoughts on what the sequential mixed methods box is?
Using qualitative data at first, and then once you kind of limit the scope, then you can do quantitative data, and then you bring the two data sets together to a conclusion and analysis at the end.
Yes, so what I heard you say is that this is the study design. Yes. And then any thoughts on why we have a box around the Michigan Cardiac Arrest Registry? Okay, this is our quantitative data set, and it also provides information about our population. So everybody who provides data to Michigan Cares falls in our population. Everybody within the 2014 to 2017 data set. And then the same for the last box. This also provides insights into our population. Okay, so this is the results section, and this should contain a summary of key results from the analysis. So you want to make sure that this is tied back to your analysis. So this was a mixed method study design. We first started with quantitative data to identify the sites, and then use qualitative data to explore why or how bystander CPR was occurring at each of these sites. This results section should also answer your study aim or hypothesis. And then it should include numbers if your data is quantitative, and it should include statements if your data is qualitative. It should only include tables and figures when requested, and this section should also be in past tense. So if you look at the top box, you'll see that this provides a summary of our quantitative data. There is a table that is not included in this presentation that also displays the results of the quantitative analysis. And then the qualitative data is captured as themes. So note the differences between the way that the qualitative data on the bottom is being displayed as opposed to how the quantitative data on the top is being displayed. Okay, so this is the final section of the abstract. This is the conclusion section, and it should include major implications. So things like what this problem implies for our current knowledge on the problem and why we should care about the research. It should also include information on any directions for future research or practice. So for instance, are there any additional questions our research raised that we were unable to answer? Is there anything that our research points to that we should look into further? And this section, unlike the previous section, will be in present tense. So we mentioned, just as a quick recap, that the introduction will be mixed tense, the methods will be past tense, the results will be, I believe I mentioned past tense, and the conclusions will be present tense. So can anybody identify what the summary of knowledge is versus the implication section? And then tell me what keywords allows you to understand that. Are there any initial thoughts on the findings or the recap of the findings versus future directions? Okay, so this first box is you can think of it as a final takeaway from everything that we learned from the study. And the second box is the implication piece. So using words like emphasize and importance, and phrases like points to, those are all additional questions that we might explore in future research or practice. As well as whatever value this implies for our current knowledge on the problem. Okay, are there any questions from folks on what has been presented or comments?
Sydney, I just wanted to say that you did an excellent job breaking this down by section. And I think that particularly as folks start to write their own abstracts, just by nature of what each of us is good at, you'll find some sections more challenging than others, and kind of revisiting that in that context, I think will be helpful too.
Thank you, Rama. And I absolutely agree with that. Other comments or questions? Okay, well, please feel free to reach out to either Rama or myself if you have any other questions that pertain to abstract writing. And I know for the Europe students in particular, within the next few weeks, you guys will be moving forward with writing your own abstract. So I anticipate that there will be some questions, and this is definitely a learn as you go, and gaining experience over time. So please don't hesitate to reach out. We have some additional resources that we've captured here. University of Michigan has done a great job, particularly with this first resource of laying out all of the different components of abstracts and what they might look like across different disciplines. And then I just want to take a minute to acknowledge a few of our folks who were instrumental in getting this training planned. So thank you to Caitlin for coordinating this, and thank you to our mentors who are working closely with a lot of you, and we'll be working on abstracts with you in the coming weeks.